For 30 years, he never made a mistake until one envelope changed everything. Arthur Bell was a man the entire neighborhood trusted without question. Every morning at 6 a.m. sharp, he left his small white house on the corner of Monroe Street wearing the same navy blue postal uniform, polished black shoes, and that faded cap that had been through more storms than most people in town. The regulars along his route had grown old alongside him, their lives quietly marked by the rhythm of his deliveries. Birth announcements, love letters, college acceptance envelopes, even the heavy grief of condolence cards. Arthur carried them all with the same careful respect. He was a fixture in the small town of Millford, Pennsylvania, a place where everyone knew each other's names, and secrets rarely stayed buried for long. But Arthur had one rule that was practically legend. He had never, not once, delivered a letter to the wrong address until the morning of October 12th. That morning began like any other. The sun was just beginning to push through the mist rolling off the river. Arthur sorted his satchel at the depot, organizing the envelopes in perfect sequence, muscle memory guiding his hands. His supervisor, Dale, clapped him on the shoulder. "Another day in paradise, Bell?" Arthur smiled faintly. "Something like that." He stepped out onto the street, the cool air biting at his cheeks. The first half of his route passed without incident. Mrs. Parker's knitting magazine, the Hendersons' electric bill, a birthday card for little Sophie Miller. At precisely 9:14 a.m., Arthur approached the worn green mailbox of 217 Lincoln Avenue. He slid a small, cream-colored envelope into the slot without really looking at it. And then, halfway down the block, something tugged at him. A feeling, subtle but sharp, like the memory of a voice you can't place. He stopped, turned, and walked back to the mailbox. He pulled the envelope out. The name on the front was Mr. William Cross, 219 Lincoln Avenue. Arthur froze. His pulse quickened. 2 numbers off. It was the kind of mistake he had avoided for decades, and yet here it was, sitting in his hand. He glanced toward 219, a tall, narrow brick townhouse with black shutters and a porch that hadn't seen fresh paint in years. Mr. Cross was a quiet man, mid-50s, kept to himself. Rumor had it he once worked in city government before abruptly resigning. Arthur took a breath, stepped toward the correct address, and slid the envelope into the right box. It should have ended there, but it didn't. Because as he turned to leave, he noticed something. The flap of the envelope wasn't sealed. In fact, it had been slit clean open. That wasn't unusual. Sometimes envelopes tore in the sorting machine, but the edges were too neat, too precise, almost surgical. And inside, instead of the folded bill or personal letter he expected, was a single photograph. Arthur glanced around the empty street before carefully sliding it out. The photo was grainy, but unmistakable. A man in a dark suit shaking hands with another man whose face was partly obscured. But Arthur knew that face. Everyone in Millford did. It was the mayor, and the man whose hand he was shaking was dead. Had been for 7 years after an alleged boating accident. Arthur's stomach tightened. The photograph had a date printed on the back, last month. He slipped the photo back inside, sealed the flap with the moisture from his thumb, and pushed it firmly into Mr. Cross's mailbox. As he walked away, he told himself it wasn't his problem. But that night, he couldn't sleep. The image burned in his mind. By morning, the news was buzzing. The mayor had been rushed to the hospital after collapsing during a speech. Cause of illness unknown. Arthur's route took him past 219 Lincoln again. This time, Mr. Cross was on the porch, smoking. Their eyes met. Cross smiled faintly. "Morning, Bell. No mistakes today, I hope?" The words landed heavier than they should have. Arthur nodded and kept walking. But from that moment, the letter and the photograph were no longer something he could ignore. He started noticing shadows that didn't belong on his street, unfamiliar cars parked too long, the subtle hum of someone following just far enough to stay out of sight. And then, 3 days later, a plain white envelope appeared in his own mailbox. No stamp, no return address. Inside was another photograph, this time of Arthur himself, standing at Mr. Cross's mailbox, holding that cream envelope. On the back, a single sentence was typed in block letters. "You delivered the wrong letter." Arthur Bell stared at the photograph in his hands longer than he should have. The paper felt heavier than any envelope he'd ever carried. He looked toward the street. Empty. Whoever left it had done so quietly, deliberately. He knew two things instantly. One, that someone was watching him, and two, that this wasn't about a wrong delivery anymore. This was about him. He slipped the photo back inside the envelope, locked his door, and drew the blinds. Years of walking the same route had made him a creature of habit, but it had also made him a creature of awareness. He noticed when a lamppost had a new scratch, when a tire track appeared on a street that hadn't seen a car overnight. And now he noticed that the small tan sedan parked across the street had been there for 3 mornings in a row, always with the same smudge of dirt along the passenger door. That night, he didn't sleep again. He sat in the dark living room with an old baseball bat resting against his leg, watching the street lights spill across the cracked pavement. At 2:47 a.m., the sedan's engine turned over and it drove away slowly. The next morning, Arthur tried to convince himself to stick to his route and keep his head down. But curiosity is a dangerous thing, especially for a man with no family, no one to warn him when he's crossing a line. At lunch, instead of heading to the depot, he walked to the small diner 2 blocks from Lincoln Avenue and took a seat at the counter where he could see 219 through the window. At 1:23 p.m., a black SUV pulled up. 2 men in dark coats stepped out and knocked on Cross's door. They didn't look like friends. Arthur sipped his coffee and pretended to read the menu. 10 minutes later, the men left. One was carrying a manila folder. The other was on his phone, speaking quickly. Cross never stepped outside. That night, another envelope appeared under Arthur's door. This time, a list of names. Some were familiar, like Councilman Harris and Deputy Chief Lang. Others he didn't recognize. At the bottom, underlined twice, was his own name, and beneath it, delivery confirmed. His heart pounded in his chest. This was no longer an accident. Someone was framing him, or worse, recruiting him without consent. For 3 days he went about his route mechanically, but his eyes were always scanning, his mind always replaying that photograph of the mayor. On the 4th day, Mr. Cross was gone. His windows were dark, his mailbox empty. No one on the block had seen him leave. That evening, as Arthur unlocked his front door, he heard the faint shuffle of feet behind him. A man's voice said, "Bell, we need to talk." He turned slowly to find a tall stranger in a gray trench coat, badge flashing briefly under the street lamp. "I'm Special Agent Moran, and you've been delivering more than mail." Moran pushed his way inside without asking. On Arthur's kitchen table, the agent spread out photographs, not just of the mayor, but of cash exchanges, private meetings, and backroom deals. In each sequence, there was one constant, a cream-colored envelope. "You think you're invisible," Moran said, "but someone's been using your route to pass evidence. Now the people in these pictures are dying, and your name's on their list." Arthur swallowed hard. "What do you want from me?" Moran leaned in. "Deliver one more letter, to me. But it has to look like it's going to the mayor's office, and you have to act like you don't know me." Arthur hesitated. His entire life had been about following the rules, keeping quiet, staying neutral. But for the first time, he realized neutrality might be the most dangerous position of all. The next morning, he found the letter waiting at the depot. No return address. He slid it into his satchel like any other delivery. But as he approached City Hall, he saw a figure leaning against the wall. Mr. Cross, alive, calm, smoking as if nothing had happened. "That's mine," Cross said, holding out his hand. Arthur shook his head. "Not today." And he kept walking, aware of Cross's eyes burning into his back. Inside the marble lobby, Moran appeared from a side hallway, took the letter, and vanished. That night, the news broke. The mayor had resigned unexpectedly, citing personal reasons. The same broadcast reported that Deputy Chief Lang had been found dead in his car. No foul play suspected. Arthur knew better. He thought it was over. Until the following Monday, when his supervisor handed him a single cream envelope with no address, just his name. Time seemed to stand still as Arthur Bell stared at the cream-colored envelope in his hand. It bore only his name, no sender, no recipient's address. Even the texture of the paper was unremarkable, thick and smooth, as if it had been prepared in a special printing shop. He slowly opened it, and inside was a single page. There were only 2 lines. "You've delivered for others your whole life. Now deliver for yourself." And beneath it, an address. 1437 Southbridge Road. He recognized that address. The old, abandoned train station outside Millford. He had last been there 20 years ago, and that was only for a passing delivery. He had a bad feeling, but his curiosity was stronger than ever. That evening, before sunset, he picked up his old messenger bag and walked toward it. The wind was cold, the leaves rustling underfoot. As he approached the station, the cold breeze poured in through the broken windows, and the rusty metal doors rattled slightly. When he entered, he saw a table in the dark corner. On the table sat another envelope, this time heavy. When he went over and opened it, he found wads of cash and a USB drive inside. At that moment, a voice came from the darkness. "Good. Just in time." Arthur turned, and Cross was there, flanked by 2 large men. "You know, Bell," he said, taking a deep drag on his cigarette, "you were the most trusted man in this city. That's why we chose you. You've done so much for us without even realizing it. But now you do. So either you're with us, or you don't have to carry mail anymore." Cross gestured at the money on the table. "This is your first paycheck." Dozens of memories flashed through Arthur's mind. The discipline that had made him trustworthy over the years, the simple yet honorable nature of his work, but also the corruption he'd seen, the darkness behind the doors he'd silently passed. He reached slowly into his bag and pulled out a small old pistol. Not a deadly one, the blank bullet pistol he carried for his mail delivery dogs. But the voice was real enough. "You'll take that money," he said calmly, "and never be seen again." Cross smiled, and the smile was menacing. "You still talk like a mailman, Bell, but the game has changed." At that moment, footsteps were heard behind him. Moran walked in, flanked by 3 federal agents. "Mr. Cross, Mr. Harris, you're in custody. Arthur, stand down." Chaos erupted. Cross's men drew their weapons. The agents fired back. There was noise, shouting, the clatter of metal. Arthur ducked under the table and dropped the USB stick into his bag. Moran grabbed his arm and pulled him out. "You're not in this anymore, Bell. We're taking over." But Arthur knew this wasn't over. The next day, the news reported that Cross and several local officials had been arrested, that a massive corruption ring had been dismantled. But the details were lacking. There was no mention of the USB stick. It still sat in the bread box in Arthur's kitchen. He picked it up from time to time, wondering what might be inside, not daring to open it. Because in that moment, he realized, in 30 years, he had never delivered a single wrong letter. But now he was keeping the biggest delivery of his life for himself. And one day, when he opened that USB stick, everything would change once again.